Like most railroads, the Boston and Maine Railroad enjoyed throughout its history fervent documentation and appreciation from those in the railfan and railroad enthusiast communities. As such, various facets of the Boston and Maine Railroad became well known among the communities and legendary in their own right. Locomotives, of course, are some of the most high-profile aspects of railroading. They make the most noise, they're the most present, and they seem to attract the most attention. But it's not the case with every type of locomotive. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about 4 classes of Boston and Maine steam locomotives that tend to get less attention than some of the other classes we've mentioned in other episodes. This is a sort of catch-all episode to discuss the quote-unquote misfits that may not have enough content to feature in their own episodes, but definitely deserve mention in the history of the Boston and Maine Railroad. The first class we're going to discuss is probably the least deserving of misfit status, as they were very important and quite numerous. In the latter days of the 1800s, the 460 type locomotive, known as a 10-wheeler, became one of the more common and well-known steam locomotive types on American railroads. With the capability for both decent pulling power and fast speeds, they were often seen in express passenger rules, but could also be seen pulling mail trains and also in freight service as well. The Class C 460s have been an all but forgotten class of machines on the Boston and Maine. Jack of all trades, they were equally at home on freight, passenger, and switching chores. Not as well known as the moguls, they performed similar tasks with ease. Well worked and scrapped early, they quietly disappeared from the scene. It had not always been this way. Sleek 2100s once pulled the varnish trains to Troy and Portland. They would proudly hold the point until the Atlantics and Pacifics came in force. And at that, they gave the Atlantics a run for their money. Although they were contemporaries of the moguls, they would eventually prove too heavy for the light rails of mogul country, and the little 260s would outlive them by some 20 years. Somewhere along the line, the C-21 class specifically acquired the term grasshoppers, although no one really knows when or why. Quite a number of these 10-wheelers had been inherited by the Boston and Maine from several different railroads. The older machines would be extensively used, until too tired to do more. As most of their time ran out on the branch lines, they became infrequent visitors to mainline trains. Consequently, few photos exist of the earlier classes of 460s, a fact bemoaned by most rail fans. Surely, fate had dealt them a losing hand in that respect. Undoubtedly the most famous and long-living class of 460 on the Boston and Maine was the C-21 class. These were built by Schenectady between 1904 and 1906, and the final examples were retired in 1937. They were all built with 20 by 26 cylinders and came in 3 different classes: the Class A's, the Class B's, and one example, number 2129, of Class C. The C-21 survived long enough on the Boston and Maine to be featured in some early film footage, and resembled the moguls, consolidations, and Atlantics in some way, with their handrails, center-mounted headlights, and certain other aesthetic appliances which gave them a certain cluttered look. Most of the C-21s were scrapped in the late 1930s, with a large number going in 1936. The very last 460 in service on the Boston and Maine, which was scrapped in May 1939, was actually not a C-21, but a Class C-19, number 2074. Incredibly, it had been built way back in August of 1898 for the Fitchburg Railroad as their number 5, and it was the very last locomotive the Boston and Maine operated that they had inherited when they absorbed the Fitchburg Railroad. Despite being less well-known and less celebrated than the moguls and some of the other more famous Boston and Maine locomotives, C-21 460s were certainly an interesting and important part of the Boston and Maine's passenger fleet. An interesting innovation to handle commuter traffic in and out of Boston and Portland were the double-ended Suburban tank engines. Built by Rhode Island in the 1890s, they were a unique solution to a unique problem. Capable of running forward or reverse with equal ease, and with pilots on either end of the machine, they could shuttle commuters out and back without the benefit or need of a turntable or Y. Doubly nice, as some of the branch lines they ran on had neither. Both 044Ts and 264Ts graced the post-1911 roster, the former bowing out by 1914 and the latter by late 1920. Larger steel cars were being acquired and the engines were 25 years old. Heavier traffic demands spelled the end for these little-known classes of Boston and Maine motive power. The Boston and Maine's 480 Mastodons were all inherited from the Fitchburg Railroad when that road was leased by the Boston and Maine on July 1st, 1900, and they became classes L1A and L1B. These locomotives were built by Schenectady and Rhode Island in 1899 and 1900 respectively, and they came equipped with 22 and 34 by 28 cylinders. Word is that they were hard-riding and difficult to fire. Toward the end of their careers, some were equipped for road switching service, complete with power reversers. In the early 1920s, some thought was given to rebuilding the Mastodons into 080 switchers, but the idea was abandoned in favor of brand new USRA 080s. Action photos of the 480s are rare, and good action shots are practically non-existent. Hence, this view of number 2902 working north around Tingsboro Curve on the Southern Division in the late teens can be considered in a class with dinosaurs and the passenger pigeon. Spending their last few years in storage at various points, the Mastodons went to the scrapper unbemoaned in 1926. The 282 locomotive emerged in the late 1800s as a new development in locomotive technology. The wheel arrangement allowed the firebox to be placed behind instead of above the driving wheels, which allowed a larger and deeper firebox which could hold a larger fire, therefore increasing speed and power. The 282 became one of the more common wheel arrangement types on American railroads. In 1897, an order of Japanese Type 9700 282 locomotives were built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works for the 3-foot 6-inch gauge Nippon Railway of Japan. The Emperor of Japan was often referred to as the Mikado in English, and so the Class 282 quickly earned the title Mikado, though this was sometimes shortened to Mike. Surprisingly, the Boston and Maine never ordered any of their own 282 Mikados, and they didn't inherit any from any other railroads in the area. In fact, the 282 was rather scarce among railroads in the New England region, some of the only ones being located on the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad. However, Mikados did make an appearance on the Boston and Maine in an interesting way. In early 1942, the Boston and Maine leased 5 282s from the Erie Railroad. These were elderly machines, and they were repainted and renumbered 2801 to 2805. They were the only Vanderbilt tendered machines ever to wear Boston and Maine garb. These were always misfits on the Boston and Maine, and eyewitnesses would state that you could hear the side rods clanking for 15 minutes before the engine even came into sight. The locomotives had been built between 1911 and 1913 by a variety of builders, Schenectady, Baldwin, and Lima. They all came with 28 by 32 cylinders and were given the class distinction N1 on the Boston and Maine. For whatever reason, they were soon deemed unfit for Boston and Maine service and returned to the Erie by the end of June 1942. Despite not having the level of fame and recognition of other Boston and Maine steam locomotives like the Moguls, Consolidations, Mountains, or Limas, the 10-wheelers or grasshoppers, the Mastodons, and the Erie Mikes certainly hold an interesting and unique piece of Boston and Maine history, and occupy a place in the story of Minuteman steam that's certainly worth mention. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to our channel so you'll never miss a new video. And head on over to our website, www.bmrrhs.org, where you can learn how to support our nonprofit organization, sign up to become a member, browse an extensive online archive of B&M materials, watch more programs, listen to our podcast, or browse our online store.